everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie. Hello if you're new here, and thanks for joining me again if you're not. Today I am doing a video request. I put out a little thing on Instagram yesterday asking if anyone had any video requests, and Peekaboorose asked how your mindset for choosing decks you're going to buy and use in a given month has evolved over your years of practice. So I don't really assign myself a deck or two or whatever to work with in the month coming. That's not how I really use my collection. So I thought instead I would just focus more generally on how I choose decks, both to work with but also to use in a reading. I tend to have 1, 2 or 3 decks just out on my desk that I'm using at any given point in time, and these tend to just be decks, either decks that I've bought recently that I want to use, or more generally just decks that I feel like using, that I want to use, or that feel appropriate for this stage in my life or the weather outside. And it's not like a logical thing, it's more just I feel like using this deck at the moment, so I leave it out on my desk until I kind of stop using it and I put it away and something else comes off my shelf. It's just a very go with the flow sort of approach. And those decks that I am using a lot at the moment at any given point either sit up on my desk or on my altar, and that's just so they're easy to reach, they're easy to use. Sometimes I'll leave certain cards out if I've done a reading recently, and that does mean that because they're easily accessible, I just go to them for a period of time until they go back up on my shelf. So some different reasons that a deck might be out. It might be out, as I said, because I've bought it recently or received it in a trade recently, and so it's a new deck that's fun and exciting and I just want to get to know and I want to work with. Alternatively, it might be a deck that I feel like is just kind of relevant in some way, so that might be relevant to something I'm going through in my life. Like maybe I'm having some feels about my great-grandmother, so I have the Guardian Angel Tarot out. It might be a deck that I haven't used in a long time and that I want to just get reacquainted with, or that I kind of miss a little bit. It might be a deck that's related to something I'm reading or interested in at the moment. Alternatively, some decks do feel rather seasonal to me, and this is still not a conscious decision of, oh, it's December, so it's summer, so that means I pull out the Dreams of Gaia Tarot. It's not that logical. Instead, it's more just a sense of it's getting warmer, so I want to work with certain decks more. It's really, and that time frame will differ. And sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Like with the Dreams of Gaia, some years it comes out November, December. This time it didn't really come out until January, February. And sometimes it hangs around for longer. It really depends. For me, it really feels like a fiery, high summer deck. That's just how it feels. And so a lot of time when I'm getting that feeling of what's happening in my environment, I'm just drawn to the Dreams of Gaia more. The saltwater reading cards are similar. That feels kind of like not just a high summer, it just feels like a summer in general sort of a deck. And this year I have used it quite a lot over summer, but the year before I didn't. So it's not this, it's summer, so the Dreams of Gaia and the saltwater reading cards come out. It's more, it's summer and it feels a certain way, and so I want to use a certain deck more. Additionally, if I go on holiday or vacation, as you do in America, if I go away somewhere for any reason, I'll often want to take a deck or two. And so that is when I'll more consciously decide on what sort of a deck I want to use purposefully while I'm away. And this is really the only time when I go away that I make like a really conscious decision of I am going to be working with this deck for a certain amount of time. And very often then I will decide on a deck based on the location of where I'm going and why I'm going away. So for example, when Mum and I went on our road trip to Bateman's Bay to see my grandmother, I took the saltwater reading cards because we were going to stay literally in the bay on the ocean front, and so that just felt really appropriate. It's the sort of energy I wanted to bring with me, and I also kind of wanted my deck to soak up all of that energy while we were away. When Mum and I went to Seven Sisters Festival recently, which is like in the bush, I took the Australian wildflower reading cards because it was a women's festival in the bush surrounded by Australian native flora. So it made sense to me to take the Australian wildflower reading cards. As for what decks I use in a reading, often it will be those decks that are out because I'm enjoying working with them, because I'm wanting to work with them, and because they're literally like within arm's reach. But that's not the only element of my decision making. Ultimately, as cliche and unhelpful as it sounds, I just go with whatever deck is calling to me. If I had to break that down, I think it's two different things. Part of it is just having worked with all my decks and knowing them really well, so having a general sense of what decks work well with what sorts of readings, with what sorts of questions, what sorts of decks I enjoy using for certain questions or topics, what sort of decks give me the sort of answers I'm looking for in certain questions or situations. So that might be something like the Fountain Tarot I go to when, you know, the topic is really big and scary and emotional or something like that, and I just want something neutral to calm the situation down. I might go to the Fountain Tarot. If I'm talking about relationships, I might go to the Mucha Tarot, because those decks just feel appropriate for those questions, and from experience, I've had good readings with those decks in those sort of similar situations. That doesn't mean I only ever use those decks for those topics, or that every time I have a topic like that, I will use those decks. There's still some leeway, but I just notice that's a pattern. Alternatively, sometimes I just get a feeling, or I'll see a card in my mind from a deck, or I'll hear a name in my head, and that's the deck I go with, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I suppose part of Peekaboorose's question was, how has this changed over my years in my practice? And that would be the big one, is that I listen to that now. I used to kind of rationalize that and be like, no, well, that's not the deck I normally use for these questions, or no, that doesn't make sense, I want to use this one's new. Whenever I do that, my readings wouldn't make sense at all. They would be just a mess, like mud on a table. And so I learnt pretty quickly that even if I hear a name or see a card for a deck that just doesn't make sense logically, it's the deck I'm supposed to be using for that question. So that would be the biggest change, is that I follow that and I listen to that. The other big change is that I really just let myself work with whatever the fuck I want, which I think you can probably tell with this video, and that's kind of the whole point of this video, is to say that I don't really tell myself that these are the decks I'm using this month, or this is the deck I have to use because it's new, or this is the deck I have to use because I haven't used it enough. I mean, I try to use my decks, you know, as many decks as I can over the course of a year or whatever. I try to use different decks and kind of put them into circulation. But ultimately what it comes down to is that I will only use really what I want to. Because otherwise I get really stuck and bored with tarot, if I'm honest. Not with tarot, but with my practice. If I'm forcing myself to use a deck that I don't want to use, my practice of tarot is going to suffer as a whole. If I'm forcing myself to do something that I'm really not inspired by, I lose interest in reading the cards. And I think that's often how I get into a slump. I get frustrated with the cards, I get frustrated with myself, I get a bit bored, I get a bit overwhelmed, I get a bit whatever. Like, I just lose touch with why I'm interested in the cards to begin with. And I suppose I kind of fall out of love a little bit. Like, not entirely, I don't fall out of love with tarot, but I fall out of love with my daily practice, or my practice in general. So in order to stay interested and to keep my practice invigorated and to continue loving tarot more and more each day, I give myself permission to use the cards that I want to. And I give myself permission to trust myself and to trust my gut when it's telling me to use a certain deck, even if it's not the deck I'm supposed to be working with. I give myself free rein for the most part as far as choosing what decks to use and when, because that's how I found I stay more interested and most interested in my practice. I stay most interested in and excited about tarot. So I might use a deck for one reading and it'll go back on my shelf. I might use one deck for 6 months and have it out on my tarot, on my altar or my desk for 6 months. There's no hard and fast rule. It really is just, I do what I want and I do what my intuition is telling me. I know some people find it really helpful to kind of each month set out, you know, 1 to 5 decks that they're going to use for this month. And for some people, that's to kind of keep them out of getting into a rut with just using one deck. Perhaps they tend to get too comfortable and not, you know, spread the love around in their collection. Or maybe they have a really big collection and they feel like unless they kind of set certain time aside for each deck, they don't go through their collection. It becomes stagnant for them. For me, that's not really how I feel about my collection. Every now and then I do kind of consciously be like, okay, I haven't used this deck in a while. Let's pull it out on my desk and hopefully I'll reach for it a bit more. But I found personally that when I kind of am too rigid with it, I can get really stuck and I can feel really closed in. I think I'm the sort of personality that I need certain rules for certain things, but if I have too many rules for myself, I just kind of like go, no, it's too hard, I don't want to do it. Like I back away from things. Whereas if I just kind of give myself free rein and I give myself permission to trust myself and do what I want, I'm more likely to do the thing than if I like gave myself too hard and faster rules. So I think in that sense, it's really important to just do what works for you. Not in terms of just, you know, picking the decks that work for you, but also in terms of how you use your decks in general, how you use your collection if you have a collection. It's important to do what works for you and what gives you provides the most space for you to have a really fulfilling tarot practice, because ultimately that's what it's about. It's not about, you know, ticking off a list necessarily. It's about growing as a tarot reader, enjoying your cards, learning about yourself and bettering yourself. It's about all of that. And so however you go about doing that, it doesn't really matter, as long as that's what's happening, or whatever your goal is with tarot. As long as you're achieving that, as long as you're, you know, setting yourself up to succeed, depending on how your personality is and what's worked for you before, you're really the best judge of that. But that is how I go about choosing my decks to work with on a regular basis and also to use in any particular reading. As far as choosing decks to purchase, I kind of have done a little bit of a video about this, and I think that was, I made some loose analogy about jeans shopping and buying decks. And that's still pretty true for the most part. Basically, sometimes I buy a deck for fun, or I'll trade a deck for fun. Sometimes it is just about trying something new and getting out of your box and being a bit open and curious to something new and fresh. And I always try to maintain a bit of that. And trades are especially, or secondhand decks are especially good for that, because then you're not investing too much money in something that may or may not work. It's 50-50. So I do enjoy getting decks that I don't necessarily think will, you know, definitely work for me. I do enjoy doing that every now and then, but I try not to just get a deck just to see too often. Especially when it's a new deck and part of me is like, oh, it's new and exciting and everybody has it. I try to be really cautious of that perspective. Sometimes it is fun, and I don't think there's anything wrong with having a bit of fun if you have some extra cash. I'm not about shaming people for, you know, that sort of thing. I think it's more just being aware of why we're doing something, so that we can make choices that are best for us. And sometimes the best choice is the fun, free, impulsive choice, but not always. As for purchasing decks, I do tend to watch a lot of reviews and unboxings and kind of really think about what I want and why I want it. And definitely that jeans analogy of basically, you know, comparing my other decks that I'm loving at the moment and thinking about whether this new deck is so exciting to me that I do really want to put away one of my other decks that I'm enjoying a lot at the moment. Because ultimately I only have a certain amount of time in a day. And so if I get a new deck, it does mean that I'm going to be spending less time with the deck that I'm currently spending time with, right? And so that's kind of my barometer, I suppose, for whether a deck is really worth it for me, is having a good think about what deck I'm going to be putting away for this new deck and whether that's something I really want to do. And so even if I'm super excited about this deck and I want to buy it and I'm ready to hit that checkout button in the cart, if I have that thought of, but I'm really liking the Lunar Soul Tarot at the moment and I don't really want to put it away, then I might be like, okay, well, I'll come back next week and see if I've changed my mind. So yeah, that's kind of a good line for me of assessing whether a deck is really something I want in my collection, or if it's just a bit of a fad that I kind of want because it's pretty, but I probably won't use. As of late, I've also tended to avoid 2 Rider-Waite-Smith clone decks, although I've just used the Lunar Soul as an example, so obviously not completely. I think it's more just because I have several Rider-Waite-Smith clones or similar decks that I love, like the Minute Tarot and the Mons Tarot, or the Little Monsters Tarot, are 2 decks that I love and that I use a lot. And I do kind of feel like I largely have that perspective covered. And so if I'm going to get a new deck, I want something a little bit different. I do love the Rider-Waite-Smith system, so I tend to be drawn to decks that are at least based on that system, but decks that look really similar to the imagery that we see in the Rider-Waite-Smith, I've kind of tended to steer somewhat clear of for the most part of late, just because I feel like, yeah, I have a number of those sort of decks that I really, really like. But every now and then I still pick up a Lunar Soul or something. I am especially cautious though of decks that are older, that I've already seen. I'm really cautious of a deck that I've already looked at and gone, not for me, but then, you know, it's gone out of print, or someone I really like on YouTube has it all of a sudden and they've shown it off a lot. I'm really cautious of me having changed my mind of a deck that I've already decided isn't for me. Obviously, there are those occasions where something really does shift in your practice, or something really does change for you, and you look at a new deck, or an old deck with new eyes, and see something that you didn't before. And you have to be open to that possibility. But I do think also I have to personally be quite cautious of that excitement of wanting to have, or fear of missing out, or, you know, somebody else has it, so maybe I should try it, or just that change that happens quickly, that all of a sudden I do want that deck that I already thought I didn't. I don't hard and fast rule out when that happens, but I do try to be extra cautious of what other emotions might be driving that, as opposed to something more like conscious of this something has changed, so that I do want to try this deck now where I might not have wanted to before. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just ultra cautious of having changed my mind, especially when it happens quickly. And especially when it happens around those two things, of it going out of print and going, oh my God, all of a sudden it looks so much more interesting and valuable. And when somebody I like perhaps has all of a sudden gotten a deck, and, you know, seeing their excitement, and, you know, just being conscious of those other kinds of excitement fueling my want for it, as opposed to something in me changing that wants that deck, if that makes sense. I'm super cautious of that response to something happening and wanting a deck from that. Those are my thoughts on choosing a deck, whether it's to purchase or trade, or to use in general, or to use for a reading. That's kind of how I go about things. And basically I have some general things that I try to keep in mind. I have some general patterns that I've noticed with my behavior. But for the most part, I really try to avoid hard and fast rules, because as a personality, I don't work well with those really strict rules around my tarot, at least I've noticed. So thank you for the question, Peekaboorose. I hope this has proved interesting to you and everybody else watching, or given you perhaps a few things to think about in your own practice. And I will talk to you next time. So much love. Bye.